Okay, with all the crazy audio problems I had the last like 2 live streams, I'm trying to get just everything spot on. Hi, hold on just 1 second. I'm gonna just make sure that this is coming through okay. Okay, I think I've got it. Oh no, it's totally out of sync. I have no idea why. What did I do? Okay, hold on. Let's see. It's always a little bit of an adventure. Apologize while I'm cycling through random things. I'm going to try to unlink and relink my audio, and then hopefully that'll just be like it, and we'll be all set and ready to go. Okay, input. Oh my goodness. It's always like this, isn't it? Okay. Well, let's see. I'm going to just do the best I can, and then I'm just going to go for it. And I'm sorry if the video and the audio is super weird. Maybe I'll just switch over to me crafting or something, or I'll fix it in post-production. Okay, I figured it out. All right, I think we got it. Okay, I'm going to check my settings one last time. Please bear with me. Anybody out there in YouTube land for now or forever in the future, hopefully I could just figure out how to trim this off last time. Okay, random talking while I'm trying to fix this. My output is my headphones. My input is my external microphone. Okay, I think we're good. Oh my goodness. Hi. Okay. We're good. We're here. I'm going to try to trim this off and I keep smacking my microphone. So last time I tried to trim my live stream, I actually trimmed out everything else and kept the really crappy, messed up introduction. I swear, I'm usually very good with technology, and for whatever reason, I just cannot. It's like I get nervous and start making really silly mistakes or something like that. Anyway, so we're going to start a little bit from the top here. Hello. We're talking art versus craft today. Really, though, we're talking about art and craft and how the differences are fewer than the similarities. This is Craft Leftovers Live. I'm Kristen M. Roach. I'm an artist, author, and entrepreneur and crafter. Thanks for joining me. and stumbling through my crazy introduction and audio problems every time, and they're always different. Comment with your questions about art and craft, and share your creative biz. What are you working on? What are you passionate about? What are you trying to get off the ground or fully immersed in and super proud of? Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm still trying to hit 100 subscribers. I'm at like 68 right now. Super baby YouTube channel. I've had it for a really long time, but don't let that fool you. I've actually just this year started actually posting regularly. Um, yeah, so let's get there. Let's get to 100. And I'm just going to jump back in since we wasted a good 10 minutes futzing around with the microphone and such. And art, craft. Why why is this such a thing even still? I get this question all the time. I kind of hoped by now that, quite frankly, I just would stop getting this question because in some ways I'm like, it's a non-issue in my mind. Doesn't matter, and maybe it matters more than I would like it to. And I think it matters even in my own life more than I would like it to. Um, so I wanted to start out, I started making this list and I found there are more similarities than difference. And I think I think that's really interesting because they are different, but they are so similar. And maybe that is where this conversation really comes from. So these are kind of like 8 to 10-ish reasons or ways that they're very, okay, gonna just redo that. These are like 8 ways that craft and art are very similar. And why in a lot of ways, I feel like this debate should in some way just get like let's just forget about it and move on, right? Let's just go make our stuff. But it is important, and it's something I've struggled with most of my life, and it's not until I got more confident in my own passion, skills, purpose, studio practice that I was like, who cares? Because I used to care quite a lot. And I'll share that story about caring quite a lot and why I cared quite a lot in my early 20s, and into my early 30s, realistically. So, how they are similar. One, I just want to get this out there. They are both really creative and absolutely worth pursuing in your life and can bring a lot of personal satisfaction, fulfillment, etc. They both can be, not always, but can be very meditative. And in that way, they can be very healing. Think about the phrase art therapy. I think that really encompasses craft therapy too. I know, especially when I was in college, I knit myself through depressions and into a better place. You know, like there's just something about it that helps you calm, relax. And I get that same feeling when I'm painting. Some people call it flow, and in creative purposes or in creative practices that you get to this like flow state where it's just this kind of blissful meditative state where you're fully present and engaged with what you're doing. It's beautiful. I get there with craft. I get there with art. I love them both. They both can have design work. A lot of my art projects, I front load a lot of design time for a project, and then after I've figured out all the design project part of it, like what am I going to be doing, color choices, or like, oops, with this beast behind me, like how crazy like how much effort went into planning the project before I wove anything, swatching, etc. And I feel like this is a project too that really spans that gap of is this art or is it craft? And what's the difference? Why does it matter, etc. So I think it's both is kind of just going to slip that in there. It's both. It's art and craft. They both Oh, anyway, but I do the same thing when I'm designing a sweater for a pattern for a magazine or the book project. Before I even started writing a single word for my book, I spent months researching, planning, figuring things out. What color or thread am I going to use? It was a very creative, the whole concept for the book, making sure that everything flows together well, that there's a strong narrative, that there's a progression, that it's engaging and impactful and useful. So that kind of brings me to the next point. They both can be very conceptual. Like people think of like, well, art, there's always a concept. That's a thing I hear a lot that people say, but what's the difference between art and craft? I've even said that myself. The more I thought about it, I'm like, that's garbage. It's a little elitist to say that there was no concept between my cat hoodie pattern with Molly. I mean, I wrote a whole story, this whole narrative, this whole thing about Molly meeting up with Rap Cat and Rap Cat giving her his hoodie, and like this whole crazy, silly story that resulted in me knitting a cat hoodie for my cat and doing a photo shoot with her out in the snow and writing it into a series of posts. And like that, there was a concept there, right? And like, I mean, yeah, seriously. Craft can be very conceptual. It can be narrative. It can have a deeper meaning than just the materials being used. And I'm talking about this in the sense of the industry and the movement, not the physicality, because quite frankly, when it comes down to it, I think that's more material choice, that like there's art materials and then there's my fingers, craft materials. But really, like, it kind of doesn't matter. Like, there's craftsmanship and there's artistry. Where's the line there? Who's to say? Definitely not me. And I've done both. And I've got a degree in oil painting and a minor in art history. And I'm also a published craft writer in magazines and my own craft book. And I'm still saying, like, material choice does not necessarily mean it's art or craft. There's traditional craft materials, but there's also traditional painting or like art materials, but the lines are blurred all over the place. And I feel like this is especially true in textile arts and in ceramic arts. And I feel like the ceramic arts people, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you might feel a little offended being called a potter. And you're like, no, I'm a ceramic artist. We're like fiber artists. We can get a little touchy if you call us a crafter instead of a textile artist. Why? Why is one better than the other? Why is one different? Anyway, I'm getting off track. Okay, so 4 was conceptual. They both really can be conceptual. They both can have narratives. They both can have a deeper meaning. They both can have intention behind the materials chosen beyond just an aesthetic choice. They're both easy and really hard. Like there is some very complicated, intricate, amazing, difficult craft out there. I don't think anyone would deny that. The same can be said for art. There's also craft and art projects that you look at and you say, what's the big deal? My 12-year-old could do that. I could do that. Whatever. And you kind of get that bit of attitude about it of like, well, I could do that. Why is this so special? And like, what's interesting is I find that in craft, that perception is powerful. Like, I could make this craft project at home, which is something I totally lean into on Craft Leftovers, right? Like, I show you everything I do so you can make it at home. Where art, when you say something like, I could make that at home, it's almost like it's a little bit of an insult. It's a little bit of a dig at the artist of like, what are you doing calling yourself an artist? I could do that at home, which is kind of fascinating. It's like, okay, then go do it. That's awesome. Like, just because I'm doing it doesn't mean you can't, or that because you can do it, what I did is less good. It's an interesting thing. I've said that, and I have had that said to me And I think especially after someone said that to me, I was like, ooh, I don't think I'm going to say that again, because that's not really kind. So I'm looking at my mic levels and they're still kind of high, so I bumped them back. Sorry if I'm blowing out my mic here. Anyway, so they can be easy or hard. That doesn't really make it art or craft. Both are that way. And number 6, you can follow a pattern or you can make it up. You know, as an artist, you can emulate, while it's maybe not like encouraged, or maybe it's even a little discouraged to copy someone else's work. I mean, there's that whole thing of like, great artists don't copy, they steal, or whatever. You're always taking in what you see and incorporating it into your unconscious, and it's going to come out in your studio. You know, and maybe you're not following a specific template, but aspects of your art are. I mean, I'm absolutely, when I make a canvas from scratch, I am absolutely copying everything I learned in art school about building canvases. When I go to do an oil painting, I am absolutely copying all the foundational work, just like I would in craft, just like I would in a knitting project or a crochet project. I'm doing exactly, it's like following a pattern. And I think a lot of people don't realize that about art, is that it's not that great artists steal, they don't copy. It's that great artists learn those shortcuts. They learn those patterns in their art making practice. And sometimes you're following somebody else's pattern, and sometimes you're following your own pattern. So like my paintings that I do of birds, or even right now I'm kind of in the middle of really focusing in on my backyard botanical series on Instagram, just to kind of take a little pressure off. I'm like essentially relaunching the work I did last summer, this summer, so I can kind of just plug and play my social media while I finish this piece, which is taking up all my studio time. And is very repetitive. It is very like, not much to see here. I'm just weaving again. And so, you know, but the gouache paintings, like, I go through the same exact steps for every single one. It's a pattern I've made for myself. I did the same thing in craft. When I made a craft kit, I would make the first pattern, and then I would just copy over and over again. And many of the great masters in painting would do this so they could hand off those basic patterns for their paintings, for the ground layers, to their studio assistants, and then they would come in and just do the finishing work that they became really well known for. Like, I think people like to point to like Rembrandt and like the hands and face, that basically his studio assistants and apprentices would do the entire painting for him, and he would just come in and do the like portrait part. So they both can follow a pattern, or you can make it up as you go along and make your own pattern, or just make your one-off, you know, like that's both art and craft do that. And then both of them, you're going to be engaged in learning, both about yourself and what sparks your creativity, and also about just the craft, the actual craftsmanship of the materials that you're using. So for me, last summer when I started on the Backyard Botanical series, a big part of that is I wanted to learn how to use gouache. Now, I didn't realize this at the time, but gouache is actually very similar to oil painting. And so I feel like I got a leg up on some people who were starting painting from scratch and jumping into gouache for the first time, because I understood a lot of the fundamentals of like layering and light and mixing and all that kind of stuff. But I was like, I just wanted something that is very intentionally getting better at the craftsmanship of using gouache, the physical application of the material I was using. And I feel like I did, and there's a lot of paintings I threw away because they were garbage. There's a lot of craft projects I have thrown away because they were garbage. And that's the fun of it too, is like you learn and you refine your skills in both art and craft. And that is the thing that I keep returning to that I love about both. And here is the last and maybe most important for this conversation today. They both can be a business. And they both, and when you take them in business form, there are a lot more similarities. But they are two different industries. And I think that's something to be aware of. There's going to be crossover, but they are different industries and they do have different industry standards and ways of operating marketing. There's going to be different types of opportunity, and there's going to be different perceived value, and there's going to be different kind of like thresholds for income, and there's going to be different barriers to entry. So, okay, got my notes. So what makes them different? Because that is a bit of what we talk about when people are like, art versus craft. Because I think there is, in that general conversation, confusion between why does it matter? What is the difference? Because I can't really tell by looking at it, by doing it, what is the difference? And for me, what I've found over the last, I've been an artist my whole life. I've been making things. I've been a crafter pretty much my whole life. And I've been in both industries, kind of one foot in each, for the last 20 years now. And it's only been recently, in the last, I would say, 10 years, that I've really gotten comfortable with those lines blurring, the differences and similarities, and what they look like in my studio. And I'd say it's really, maybe the last 5 that I've really honed in on that and developed it. Which you can see that, like, I have these 3 different businesses now and I struggled with, like, do I just put this all together under one name, or do I keep them separate? And what is the pro or con there? Like, shouldn't it just be all under my name, Kristen M. Roach? Like, why keep this separate? Craft Leftovers brand or Littlewoods brand, like, what's the purpose there? And so I think the thing is that looking at it from a business perspective really helped. So, like, with Craft Leftovers, I am reaching a different segment of the population than I do with my art brand, Kristen M. Roach. Like, literally just KristenMRoach.com. On Facebook, it's like KristenMRoach.art, that kind of thing. And that is because I'm reaching a different segment of the population. I'm reaching people who are interested in different kinds of things. They want to learn different things. And when it came time to do this podcast on creative entrepreneurism, in a lot of ways, I was like, shouldn't I just put this under my own name? And then I realized that the people who are going to be most interested and most impacted and curious about what I'm talking about are the ones who are engaged in making things themselves. Because they might be at the point where they're considering, or they already have, you might already, I should just talk to you. You might already be at the point where you're making your business. You're taking the thing that you're making and turning that into your core business. And that's a different kind of person than I'm trying to tell you about this new painting series I just launched, and I want you to put it in your home. Like, you might be curious in my paintings. Like, definitely go check them out. They are beautiful. And I think you would love to know, I actually made the walnut frames myself from Iowa rough cut walnut slabs. It was a whole process. Someday I'll post about it on Craft Leftovers. But, like, yes, absolutely go check out my paintings. But I know that you're the kind of person, you might just paint your painting yourself, which is awesome. And that's why I love you. And that's why I want to talk to you about, creative business topics. So anyway, there's a bit of that, like, just industry-wise, it's maybe 2 different types of people. Or, like, when I was selling craft kits and patterns, that's very different than when I'm selling finished objects. So even within the industry of craft, that is two different segments that you're talking to, and you're going to structure your business differently depending on which audience you're trying to reach. Of course, there will be overlap, but the core of what you're doing is going to be informed by that. So anyway, so what makes art and craft different? For me, I have found it is context, like where you are placing your work. So am I intending for my paintings to be at a craft fair, like a finished object at a craft fair? Or am I intending that, or am I, like, I've definitely done craft tutorials about making your own paintings and collages. Like, think about my zine, collage it, bringing weaving, bringing the outdoors in with weaving, I think is another zine I did back in the day. That's more like art, craft, etc. together. So that's like a context, right? It's like where people are coming across it is going to inform how they feel about it. There's also your intention. So it's a little bit of like, that's the external, like, how is the public going to perceive it? They're going to perceive it based on like where you are placing it, So like, are you placing it in a museum, or are you placing it, or like a gallery, like a fine art gallery, or are you placing it at the indie craft fair, which is awesome. I love indie craft fairs like Renegade and such. And, in a magazine, on your craft blog? Are you teaching someone how to do what you do versus saying, take this thing home with you? Like, there's a little bit of the context where it's being shown that I think really informs the viewer of your work what it is. Is it craft or art? Then there's the intention you have. So a little bit, I really want to swear here, but I'm not going to. Public be darned. It's your intention, right? So like, do you perceive yourself as an artist? I truly feel that if you're struggling, like, am I an artist? Am I a not? The way to be an artist is to declare it so. But if you really thrive and love and feel an attachment and resonance with crafter, with weaver, with seamstress, with crocheter, knitter, etc., yarny, go for it. Embrace that. And by you embracing that, you will project that out to the public, and they will then perceive it so. And if they don't, you can correct them. Be like, oh, no, I'm not an artist. I'm a yarny. Boom, done. Like it can be as simple as that. Now, the other thing that makes them a bit different is bias. So when I say this, there's definitely perceived value, right? I would say there are exceptions to every rule, but part of the reason why I identify as a interdisciplinary artist, so even bias within the art sphere of like textile art versus painting versus etc., I identify as an interdisciplinary artist, one, because I'm just going to declare it so, right? Because I am, but also because of the perceived value. As an interdisciplinary artist engaged in weaving, my work can demand a higher value than as a weaver making an interdisciplinary project. It's an interesting thing. In a lot of ways, it feels really infuriating and ridiculous. It's true. I'm not denying it. But it is the nature, I think, just of the art world. And so when I'm applying for grants, etc., I don't necessarily identify as a fiber artist or as a crafter who's engaging in an interdisciplinary project. I say I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and my project happens to be made. Like my materials and techniques happen to use weaving. I know it seems really silly. And like, why does that even matter? And isn't that even a little stuck up? But it's like, you gotta kind of play the game a little bit, especially if you're trying to make a living at it. You can be a rule breaker and you can put it out there and be like, this is what I'm doing to you. But there's also a little bit of there's industry standards and there's perceived value. The other thing I've noticed, and I kind of gave a warning when I sent out a newsletter about this live stream, that I was going to talk about a bit of sexism I've experienced. So this is where we're going to get into that, is this bias conversation. Is there's a lot of sexism in art. And what's interesting is the thing that actually, there was a couple instances that really infuriated me. One came later. This idea of women's work. I hate that. It may be true that during the 1900s, maybe even to a bit of the 1800s, that there is women's work in the home. But that's not that long a time, considering how long humans have been around. And there's this like idealized notion of like women being at home, like mending and crafting and making things for their families and that kind of thing. Men were equally engaged in that in a different way. And with the Industrial Revolution, everything got kind of crazy and mixed up. But in some cultures, weaving was traditionally done by men. Like it's people in the army, men, were required to know how to mend and darn and sew out in the field so they could fix their own gear. Like, it's ridiculous. But it plays into perceived value, this idea of women's work. And there are a lot of women who historically were engaged specifically in textile, domestic arts. That I'm getting into a whole bag of worms here. I'm probably going to really put my foot in my mouth. But the thing is that all genders have been engaged in the act of making things. And in the realm of art and craft, especially in the whatever century we're in right now, 2022, like, it doesn't matter. Anybody can make anything. But the place where I see this bias show up in a really infuriating way is that if you go to a gallery and you see two textile arts of similar quality, skill, conceptually strong, like a really great idea behind it, wonderful craftsman execution, and one is made by a man and one is made by the woman, the man's will always be getting a higher price, getting more notice in the press. It's kind of like what happened with the Olympic athlete who is knitting on the sidelines. Oh, I'm really digging into it today. So I love that they were doing that. Like, that's awesome. It's a great way. Like I said, it's a great way to calm your nerves, settle down. What do you think the reaction would have been if it was a woman knitting or crocheting on the sidelines? It would have been very different. And a while ago, I kind of did some journaling when Knitting in Public Day came around, because somebody said to me something to the effects of like, knitting in public, what's the big deal? Not to go totally old lady on you, but 20 years ago when I was first getting into knitting, it was very frowned on to knit in public. It felt exactly the same as the debate we've been having about nursing in public. It was bringing something from the domestic sphere into the public sphere. And it really was a revolutionary act for a bunch of people, both men and women, to say, we are going to collectively, massively across the globe on this specific day, take our knitting with us everywhere and knit in public. It was very powerful. And now it's really fun and awesome, and I love it. But 20, years ago, very, very different feeling about it. Very different experience. Okay, so then this is going to get to the personal story. I hate, like, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about this. And I feel really nervous all of a sudden. Like, I feel like this is the 10th episode, so I'm like really digging in, like we're going to bring it all out there. Okay, so some of you may or may not know about my history with art and craft. I grew up doing both. In high school, this is like in the 90s. So think like the feminist movement that was kind of happening there. It was very much so a rejection of all things feminine. So being a feminist was actually being anti-feminine in a lot of ways. You wore your jeans and your black shirt and you smoked and you rejected everything. I actually didn't smoke, but there was this very feeling of like, in order to be taken seriously out in the world, to get higher pay, I need to act like a man, or like society's standard or kind of perceived what a man is. And I love that we're having a different kind of conversation now about genders. But, back then it was very like, I'm a woman and being a woman is less than. So in order to be more than, I need to reject my femininity, So, and part of that rejection was rejecting craft. I went to art school, and was in the painting program, and and then my grandma passed. Well, so this was like after my grandma had passed away. She passed away while I was in like community college anyway. Doesn't really matter timeline. So I just moved away to college after getting my associates at a community college, which was a struggle. I know a lot of people think like community college, oh, that's so easy. Like, what's the big deal? It actually took me 5 years to get my associates, because the thing about community college is a lot of the people who are at community college are there because they need, because they're a non-traditional student. So I was helping take care of my grandparents. I was working almost full time, and I was trying to put myself through school. With a bit of, my parents helped me as much as they could, but my sister and I were the first generation to actually go to college. Anyway, so like, it was a long path for me. I was also suffering from like, I'm just throwing it all out there today. I was suffering from some pretty massive manic depression, as well as seizures. I'm epileptic, and so like I was having, that was like the worst time for me was during that time. But I made it through. It took me 5 years, but I got there. And then I transferred to university to finish my undergrad in art. And it was about that time that my parents were like decluttering their own house, which is awesome. And they were like, we have all this stuff we kept for you from when your grandma passed a couple years ago. Do you want it or do you not? And I said yes. I could not let it go, even though I had like firmly rejected craft. And we're going to see how this is like so ridiculous. So like my ideas on it were so ridiculous that like craft is feminine, like this, it's garbage. So it was a garbage idea of a young person. And I met this guy, and he was like, why do you have all this yarn, etc. And I was like, well, I don't know how to knit or anything. And so my boyfriend, so this is where it's like funny, it was my boyfriend who actually taught me how to knit. And from knitting, I then started to learn how to sew, because I had all this fabric from my grandma and her sewing machine and serger and everything. And I started out my craft career with a lifetime of craft supplies. And from my boyfriend, who's now my husband, Jason, teaching me how to knit, I was able to get a job at the yarn store. It's called the Yarn Exchange. Unfortunately, it no longer exists in DeKalb. And I started, and that was my start into the craft industry. Now, so I'm starting craft leftovers around this time too, shortly after, because I have this lifetime of stash, and I'm like, I have to hold myself accountable to use up all this stuff. I was also so excited about craft, and so I was like buying all this stuff, and I had all these leftovers, and I'm like, there's no patterns that are like small little projects to use this, because the internet was like a baby in the craft blog world, and just totally nuts. And so like that's kind of all happening, and I'm like, but I'm still battling with this like art versus craft in my mind and in my studio, and I'm being an oil painter, and I'm being a crafter. I'm being a yarny. I love both. And so I start bringing my knitting to class, and I'm like knitting before class or like during lectures, and some professors totally cool with it. The women professors were totally cool with it, I actually should say. My male professors were not. And one art history professor forbade me from crocheting in class, even though I was getting straight A's and obviously paying attention. It actually helped to focus me, because if I wasn't crocheting and keeping my hands busy, I was going to be like drawing and off in my own imaginary world on my notebook. So anyway, and then my other professor, the thing that sucks is I had a lot of admiration for him. I really liked him. And I was knitting before class, so it was my own time. Class hadn't started. And I was just sitting there knitting, hanging out with friends, talking about the upcoming thing. I had my stuff all set up. And he came up to me and he said, "Get that craft bleep out of my classroom, out of my studio." And I felt angry and ashamed and confused, because I had been learning about fiber arts. I had been learning about like craft is a valid art material, and here he was being totally unprofessional and rude and inappropriate. But like, I can say that now as like an almost 40-year-old. But when you're 22 and you're feeling very vulnerable and new and you're wanting to make a good impression, and someone you admire, tells you that, it hurts a lot and it affects you. And I think it was that moment in time that then reset me, and it took the next several years for me to get over it and to like reconcile and really affirm myself, like, that was not okay, and he is wrong. But that's like taken me, I'm like laughing because it's uncomfortable, right? But that's taken me a really long time to be able to say that, like that's not easy. And when you're going through it, it's really difficult. So thankfully, well, and I gotta say, even though I worked my butt off in that class, I completed all the assignments, and honestly, I think I did many of them better than my peers. I got a B. And it was the only B I got in art school, period, in any of my art classes. And I'm just like, well, that's interesting. And he was super biased against me because he knew I worked at a yarn shop. He knew that I was making my way as a pattern writer. Word kind of got around that I had started this craft zine in the department, and he really didn't like that, and he thought it meant that I wasn't taking my art seriously, which is a freaking joke. Thankfully, my my not academic advisor, my advising professor, my advising faculty, Katie Kahn, she really set me straight on the issue pretty quick because I was like, I don't understand, and she was like, well, first of all, that's ridiculous. Secondly, it was your own personal time and he had no right to tell you that. And thirdly, have you ever thought about taking weaving? Like, we have a textile arts program here at Northern, and that's how I met Christine LaFaso, who taught me all about natural dyeing and weaving and etc. and helped me refine my craft and taught me more about how it can be used in the art field, art industry. And, I'm forever grateful for all of those experiences, even the bias, because even though it took me a long time to get over it and incorporate it and move on, I feel like it's really made me much more solid in my, what's the word I'm looking for? It's solidified my resolve of like what I'm doing. So, it's like, yeah, it's out there. And I think it's less now than it was in 2000, that would have been like 2006, 2007. But it's still out there and I still get it. And, I even get it about my other business, Little Woods. They're like, oh, you run a cute little tea shop. And I'm like, I'm running a 6-figure business that like distributes nationally and like has employees and it's a cute little tea shop. Bias. And I don't think people are necessarily even trying to be insulting or dismissive, but it definitely feels that way on the receiving end. And it's hard. It's hard to face that. So I don't know. It's interesting. So what makes art different is, I kind of said that one of the things was bias, but that there's this bias against which materials you use. But I think that's probably true in craft too, right? Like some knitters can be pretty snobby towards crocheters. Potters can be kind of snobby towards other mediums, like we all have bias. Like, oh, you're a tatter. Actually, I think tatting's pretty cool. It's something I've never actually been able to figure out. But, like we all have these biases. And I think that we need to be careful about that because just because I love to knit and that it's really valuable to me in my life and I understand it and appreciate it more than maybe cross stitch, doesn't mean that somebody who cross stitches, like that the way they're spending their time is less valuable than the way I'm spending my time, or that their work is worth less. Now, that does bring another part of the equation, and this is where they are similar. A lot of it is about perceived value. So we're going to put the bias stuff behind you. There's perceived value. So like I talked a little bit about that with this project that, what I'm like, I could probably demand a higher price for this as an art piece than as a woven coverlet, because I'm using overshot wool. It's like a traditional coverlet thing. So to weave a coverlet and try to sell it in the craft industry, in the craft world, I would get a certain price. To create a coverlet that's part of this art project about bird migration and etc., that's going to demand a different kind of price. Now then the question becomes, in either case, is there someone who actually will buy it? And so that's where it's like building up your audience and all that jazz, and that there are starving crafters just as much as there are starving artists. And you hope you'll make it. You may not. And some of the things that I think are inherent to both art and craft too are this idea that if you do something for the passion of it, that it's not as valuable if you do something just because it's work. Because like, well, you'd be making it anyway. So, and I feel like that's usually a clue that, oh, they're going to really lowball me on this and offer me less than minimum wage. Then there's also just like the things you make because you want to see them in the world, knowing that you will never be able to demand a price that's equal to even minimum wage on your labor. So for instance, I have made some ridiculously fancy washcloths for myself for the pure joy of making them. Unless I was an extremely famous artisan or crafter who was world renowned for their awesomely amazing face cloths, I probably couldn't get even minimum wage for them. Because when it comes down to it, when people go to buy a dishcloth or a face cloth, which might get you a slightly higher price than a dishcloth, actually it would get you a higher price than a dishcloth, they have in their mind this kind of like accepted range. And that's kind of like what the market will bear. So while there's always exceptions of that exceptional, I'm not even going to say exceptional artist, the artist who is the exception to the rule and their work just skyrockets in value, or the crafter who does that, there's like kind of what the market will bear for that kind of work. So you can look around you and you can see, like, as an average painter selling on Etsy, I know for a gouache painting of this size, I can generally expect to get this much money. And so then you rework from a business perspective, then you think, okay, how can I make this painting so the labor and the material cost makes sense for what the market is currently bearing? Over time, of course, you can demand more for your work as there's a higher demand, because since you're the person making it, there's a bit of scarcity. You can only produce so much. And so as the demand outstrips your capacity, you can then start to elevate your price. And those things are the same in art and craft. Now, where you're selling them, those might be a little different. Or they could be the same. Artists and crafters sell on Etsy, sell in kind of like indie craft fairs or fine art festivals or craft fairs. There's a lot of different pathways. And we could explore that in a future live stream about, like where to sell your work based on what you're doing. But I would need to hear from you. So leave a comment, send me an email, etc. Let me know. So I think that kind of covers it, of like my own personal experience of craft bias from the fine art industry that I've had, my own way of navigating that into the future. And I think my big takeaways is on the one hand, whatever. On the one hand, there is kind of no difference. On the other hand, there are differences in the industries, and that I think that there is a craft industry and there is a art industry, and those are two separate things. But as far as in your studio practice, it has mostly to do with context of where you're displaying your work and your own personal intention. I personally, I'm an artist first, but wait, I'm kind of a crafter first. And I think that's why when I talk about a lot of these things related to business, related to my own studio practice, I don't say my craft room or my art studio. A lot of times I say my studio practice, or just my studio and leave it there. in referring to my businesses, I often say, or even like myself as a business owner, I'll say that I'm a creative entrepreneur. It's not that I have a craft biz or an art biz, it's that I'm a creative. And that's the thing, is that in my core, whether I'm knitting or crocheting for fun, for my home, for utility, or for the gallery, or for the gallery, it's an expression of my own personal creativity. And it brings me joy, and happily now, it also brings me revenue. So that's kind of it. So what does art and craft mean to you? How does that come into play in your life? I really do want to know. So leave a comment. We can keep this conversation going offline. Well, not off air, I guess. Not live later. And I'll follow up and make sure to answer any questions you have for me. And yeah, that's it. So I'm going to flip back and say the things I'm supposed to say. Like, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, leave a review, etc. And in a couple days, check out the show notes for resources and, sign up for my newsletter, both Craft Leftovers and my art business, which you can find at craftleftovers.com and kristenmbroach.com. And I guess that's it. Until next time, bye.